Hey everyone, welcome back. In the previous episode, we built our statistics interactor, which pretty much caused us to refactor a lot of our voting system layer along with a counter manager, but we accomplished essentially the logic behind displaying the voting information. In today's episode, we're going to take a look at the ASP.NET Core level and building a web server. Okay, so in our source folder, let's go ahead and add a new project. We're going to go for ASP.NET Core Web Application. Let's click Next, and let's call it voting system.ui, and we'll create it. And for the template, we'll just choose empty, and we'll start from the beginning and build on our knowledge step by step. Okay, so now that we have created it, first of all, notice that the icon is a little bit different, and the first thing I want to point you to is we will grab the voting system.ui and we'll double click on it to reach the CSproj file. And then we'll double click on the voting system.application, and we can put them side by side and kind of take a look that first of all, the voting system.application is .NET standard, and this doesn't include a lot of the packages that a .NET Core app 3.1 would. But the main difference I want you to take a look at is the SDK here. So SDK usually stands for a toolbox, right? It's a collection of tools. Even things like a task class, right? The thing that allows you to do asynchronous operations. That is part of the C# runtime. That is a tool that C# provides, okay? So here we have .NET SDK. This is part of the .NET Core tools, and here we have SDK.web. This is the toolbox needed to build web servers. So with this, you can expect access to a lot more classes and functions, etc. But of course, your bundle size of the project that you build will be larger. And I'm telling you this, if you're confused at this point, just know that depending on the SDK provided at the top here, you get access to different types of classes. So for example, in our solution explorer, if we go to startup or even program, this will be the entrance. Here we have the iHost builder. If we go into our application layer and we go to the statistics interactor somewhere here, and we try to bring up our iHost builder, we're not going to be able to find it unless we get Microsoft.extensions.hosting.abstractions, which is part of the packages that you will find in the dependencies of the framework of Microsoft ASP.NET Core. So let's go ahead and jump into the program.cs file, and we'll quickly go over what's happening here. So in here we have our main function, and much the same way how we had our sandbox project here. Right, if we scroll down to the main function, this is just the entry point for the application. When we click the run button, this is how it knows where to start executing the application by convention. And the first thing it will do is it will run this create host builder, okay, which essentially specifies some configuration, and it points to this startup class, which we'll get to in a second. But essentially, you have a builder, which is a builder pattern, so you will specify the types of things that you want to add to your iHost builder. Or for example, here we have the host class. We create the default builder, and then we only configure the startup class. There's a bunch of other things we can configure here, like logging, container item, I'm not sure what that is, configure services, so we can configure our services, right? Even if you don't know these things, these are essentially the basic building blocks of your web server, okay? And then all we do is we call run on it. And what run does is essentially would be something like a while loop, which goes indefinitely or more event driven, that essentially loops for infinity and listens for your calls. So it doesn't always use 100% of your processor, so it's not always looping like 100%. It's more event driven. So it's sitting there and it's waiting for a call to appear on a host. I'm not going to explain exactly how that does it, but all you have to know is that it's sitting there waiting for a request to come in. Okay, and this is where we get to the startup file, right? So when a request comes in, how does it know what to do, etc. So let's go ahead and remove these comments so that they're not blinding us with that useless information. And we will see two functions here. We'll see the configure function and configure services function. They are two equally important functions, and they serve two very different purposes. The configure function is your middleware. So if you know what middleware is, you're in a good spot. If you don't know, you can go to the documentation and you will see something like this, which will show this graph and it will give you this explanation of the pipelines, etc. So even though this diagram is good, I don't feel like it includes all of the picture, because you have your business logic and it's not really showing where that is here. So if we jump to this painting I quickly painted, essentially these arrows are, again, this is your request going in and this is your response going out at the bottom. Each individual square is your middleware layer. Okay, so your response comes in, and based on the response, you can't change the response, but you can change the state of your application based on the response coming in, or you can short circuit. So let's say a response is coming here. This is the authorization, so the green bit is authorization, and we check for a authorization cookie. If it's not present there, we'll say you're not allowed to go there, and we'll shoot out the response here, or we will essentially say, right, go out here straight away, and we will put in a 403 or a 401, depends on if you're authenticated or unauthorized, right? So this is the kind of things that happen. So your middleware, let's say you go through your first middleware, which will essentially analyze what route you're using. So this is what we will have in our application, so use routing. So that will sort of ingest what endpoint are you hitting, right? And then you might have authorization, you might have some caching maybe, and then you will have the controller mapping, right? So this is the stuff that says, okay, you've hit some route, it's time to execute some logic based on this route. So the execution of your main logic, and what I mean by main logic is the stuff that we have built in those three other packages, happens inside the middleware, okay? But it's important to distinguish that your main logic, so your voting system logic, you need to separate it, okay? It stands in a quite distinct line. You should not put your voting logic inside the middleware. The middleware is all about the HTTP communication. And based on the requests coming in and responses going out, it should be doing something, okay? And its primary job is based on a request coming in, it needs to create a response that's coming out. If it's a short circuit based on authorization, or if it's a successful request and then goes, right, I actually need to execute some logic, it will go to the main logic, and that will be the response. So the middleware is going to be consuming your main logic to craft the response, okay? So that's essentially the job of the middleware, and we'll jump into dissecting it, or basically manipulating and doing some stuff to sort of get some understanding about it. But I also want to talk about the services, and the services is how you get your main logic. So you have these three packages of database, application, voting system. So the services is how you get your main logic into the middleware, okay? How that happens is basically the whole app sits in a dependency injection container, right? And usually it's referred to as DI. So if I talk about DI, dependency injection, it's about basically taking the services that is your main logic and either putting them in this middleware, in this middleware, in this middleware. We're essentially injecting our logic into any layer of the middleware. But usually all the injection happens at this last layer. And again, as we're going to be building this up, you're going to see how this works exactly. So that's the explanation for middleware. I'm not going to save this. And let me close this browser. Let's go ahead and play around with this. So to dissect this middleware real quickly, what we have here is we're checking the environment of our development environment, right? So when we go and ship this, this is going to be changed to production, and this middleware is not going to be executed. So we're going to be missing a block, which I explained on the painting, okay? But this doesn't really matter right now. What matters are functions like these, where we essentially pass our HTTP context around the middleware, and we get to read information from it or write information to the response. So here all we're doing is we're recognizing what route we're hitting and what are we going to do based on the route that we have just received. Okay, let's go ahead and run this, and all this is doing is we're basically going to return hello world when we hit the base route. Okay, so we've just launched the wrong application, so I will change the application to voting system UI. Let's go ahead and run this. Okay, so here we go. We have a simple hello world because we're sort of hitting this route, and if we go to something like hi here, we are gonna get a 404, right? So this is a default response. So what I want to do is I want to show you what you can do in this middleware. As I said, there are parts where the request is coming in, and then there is the request is going out. Okay, and the requests coming in and going out are in the middleware where it's getting called. It's not outside of these points. Okay, it is inside this function itself. So before the request comes in, we can do some things that we write to the response. So once we have written to the response, we can no longer modify the response, and I'll show you what I mean by that. So if we grab our context, I'm going to just put a semicolon on the end here because that will make my life a little bit easier with the IntelliSense. I will go ahead and I'll grab the status code and I will assign it to a 201. I will launch the application and I will open my DevTools, so when I refresh the page here, I can see that the status code is 201. Now if I close this and I will try to modify the status code of the response after we have sort of written the response, right? So when we write the response, we send it back. So we can no longer modify it. We sort of solidify the response. There it is. That's the way it is. We can no longer change it. So let's go ahead and refresh here. You can see that the status code is still 200, right? So whatever changes we're going to try to make to the response after we have written to it, those are no longer applicable, okay? And another way that we can actually take a look at this is if we take the context, we'll grab the response and again semicolon so I can see the options. I'll grab the content type and I'll say something like application/JSON. And let's go ahead and run this. And for this, I will grab Mozilla because it's a little bit easier on displaying JSON. Let's go ahead and continue. And you can see that it recognizes this as JSON, but it can't actually parse it because it's not actually JSON, it's just text. So what I will do now is I will go ahead and move this down after. And what I will do is I'll refresh this page. And once it's loaded, you can see that Mozilla no longer recognizes this as JSON because the context type is going to be, if we look in the network tab, let's refresh, type plain text. Okay, so this is pretty much just to understand that once we write to the response, it is immutable. We can no longer change it. We can no longer write to it again. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to quickly write a quick custom middleware to essentially get an understanding of a service. So how can we inject stuff into our middleware, right? What I will do is I will just create a simple middleware that will accept, or rather put application.json before the invocation of our route. So it's an easy way to check, or even we can do the status code, right? So what I will do is I'll just create a public class, custom middleware. Yeah, I mean, that looks alright. What we will need is a constructor, and this is just by convention. And the thing that we'll need to pass to this constructor is essentially, I will bring in something like the use statement, which is like a mini middleware, essentially, right? So you will see adds a middleware delegate to the application's request pipeline. We can take a look at here, and we can see that it accepts a request delegate. Now, what a request delegate is if you know anything about delegates, it's essentially a function. And middleware is essentially functional programming techniques. And I will go into middleware a lot more in details in another video. But for now, just note that this is going to be a function. Okay, so let's grab this type. And this is just something that's going to have to go into the constructor. And usually you're not going to write your own middleware all that much. I very rarely do it. But this is just a good way to understand how middleware works, okay? And why you can hit your controllers and why responses are going out. This is just a very useful way to understand what ASP.NET Core is about, okay? So let's go ahead and name this request. Let's make a field, and another function that we will need to create is a public task. So this is something that's going to return a task, and we'll need to pass invoke here. And let's say it's an HTTP context. And again, this is something that the middleware requires you to do. Okay, so now what we will do is essentially grab the request and let's return the invocation of this function with the context that we pass as a parameter, right? So as I said before, this is just a function, right? Function as a parameter, same way as we would call invoke here if we would want to, right? So we're calling this function recurringly. This is sort of what's going to happen. Other middlewares have essentially the same function, and this might give you a little bit of head spinning because even though I know how this works, it spins my head as well a little bit just thinking about it. But no, this is just how it calls from one middleware into the other, right? And doing something similar here. So we'll grab that. We'll just write our context response content type application.json or /JSON. And what we'll do instead of use, we'll say use middleware. And all we have to do is provide the type here. So just to reiterate that point where I said that the middleware is not on the outside, the middleware is on the inside. What I mean by that is the request is coming in here and the request is going out here on return. But if we make this function asynchronous, we no longer need to return this task, and this is just something that we await on. And this is going to be a task on its own, okay? So the request is going out here. So once we hit this middleware, first we'll hit the routing, then we'll hit the use middleware. We will pop in here into this function. We'll do this mutation on the content type. We'll call the next. We will then pop in here where the request is coming in. We'll write our response, and then we're going out, right? So once we're reaching the end of this function, we're then reached the end of this function, and then we're going next, and we've reached the end of this function. Okay, so it's something similar to sort of having this function inside here and this function inside here. Although you can see how impractical that is. If you have like 10 layers of middleware, you're gonna have like a pyramid going off your screen, right? So this is how you can kind of chain it elegantly, okay, and more readable as well. So let's go ahead and run this and let's see this. Let's go ahead and launch Mozilla so we can see that our application.json is being written, okay, and you can see that it recognizes it as JSON, but JSON is not valid, so it can't actually parse it, okay? So we'll close this and we'll get to the service part, right? Everything that we register here in the services is essentially units or little blocks of code you give to your middleware to execute. In our case, on the final end, right, when we're going to be writing to the request in the controllers, this is when we're going to be passing our logic to our main business logic, right? We're going to grabbing our business logic, we'll register it as services, and we're going to be putting it on the end of our endpoints, right? If you remember how the orange block was going into the big bubble, if you don't, go ahead back to that video because I haven't saved the image, so you can't see it again. All right, so let's go ahead and inject a bit of logic into here. So all I want to do is I want to write a super simple service. I will write a service, public class, I will call it 201 service. If I can call it that, I cannot. I will say 201 service, right? And all it will do is it will have a function that will return a 201. So the same way that I have modified the response status code here, that's all I want to do here as well, but with the help of this service. So this is just to understand how the dependency injection container injects this into your middleware, okay? And how later on it will work with the controllers and actions, okay? So we'll just say get code here, and we'll return 201. Simplest service I ever wrote, surely. Now what we need to do is we need to go into services, and I will add singleton for now. Now, there basically we have add singleton, we have add transient, and we have add scoped here. The difference between these services is the lifetime of these services. and we will go into that a little bit later. For now, all I will do is I'll opt in for a simple singleton. And what have I named? Service 201. Let's go ahead and register this type. So now that we have registered this type, it is available globally to our application. And again, going back to Program CS, when we configure our host here, it's going to grab the class startup. It's going to execute these two functions. It's going to create your pipeline, and it's going to register all your services. And then your application runs. So this is how your application, it first gets built up, and then it starts to run. Okay, so this is how it sort of collects all the pipes, all the services, and then it runs. It knows how to put it all together, right? So once we have our service added to our application, let's go ahead and inject it. All we need to do is just say service 201. We'll just call it service for now, and I will do context dot response status code service and get code. Okay, let's go ahead and run this. Okay, so we're here in hello world, and if I refresh this, I can see that the status code is 201. Now, this may seem a little bit magical, and it is until you know what reflection is. And reflection is not a beginner topic, although it is not hard to learn these days because there is so much information available around it. It's no longer a new concept. It's something commonly used, and frameworks like these and Entity Framework are built on reflection and its concepts. But for now, no, the Dependency Injection container can inject your service at any layer of your middleware, right? So let's say we use this part of the middleware, we might inject some services. We use this part of the middleware, we inject some services, and then we use this part of the middleware, we can also inject some services. Okay, and this will be it for this episode. All I wanted to cover here is basically how your application starts up, what's the main difference between your web application and your libraries that you have been building. It's just a matter of having access to these interfaces, different tools that are available to you. For example, even this middleware pipeline, the dependency injection container where you register it. And then I wanted to go over also how it basically grabs your middleware and services, builds them all together, and then runs the application. And then obviously how middleware works and how services actually can be injected into your application. And I guess it's worth showing that services can not only be injected into these functions, and most of the time they're actually injected into the constructor. So let's go ahead, have this final little demonstration here, and we'll round up the episode. Okay, and let's see, there it is. So 201, and usually it's actually worth seeing what errors we would get like. So if we comment this out, right, we're no longer registering this service. So it does not know how to resolve this. Let's go ahead and run this. Okay, and here's where we are getting an exception. Unable to resolve service for type, voting system, blah, 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 while attempting to activate, blah, 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 blah. So it's trying to activate some kind of class, and it cannot because some kind of class that we refer to as service cannot be injected into that class. Okay, so that's the kind of error that you're going to encounter. And just know this could be a very common error because as you're starting off, you're going to forget to put stuff into your dependency injection container, and you might encounter that error quite a bit. But this will be it for this episode. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed it, leave a like, subscribe. If you have any questions, make sure to leave them in the comment section. Don't forget to join the Discord server. And hopefully, I'll see you in the next episode.